This neighborhood is where childhood began and dreams were born.
I always felt safe living in Toulon. It was pretty quiet. There really wasn't any turmoil.
But nightmares can lie in the shadows of a tranquil street.
Sometimes a neighbor can be a neighbor from hell.
You can't sweep evil under the rug.
Get out of here! Something inside me said something bad's gonna happen.
Just because you know something's coming doesn't mean you can get out of its way.
What the hell's your problem?
That's when he snapped.
It was something you see on TV. It wasn't something that happens to you.
I just remember hearing a loud crack.
America's heartland is peppered with tiny little hamlets like ours.
Toulon's a pretty small town. Everybody knows everybody, literally. Either friends, family.
Everybody always seemed really friendly. It's just a safe little town.
Not much can happen here that the town doesn't know within a matter of minutes. It's typical small-town America.
Kurt and Virginia Thompson have been living here for as long as anyone can remember.
Virginia Thompson was my bus driver when I was a kid.
You want another jar?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna need another jar.
Kurt and Virginia were pretty independent. They liked to grow their own food and do as much on their own as they could.
Okay, we're good.
We all knew Kurt as a hard-working man who earned everything he had in life.
I'll get you one of those.
His father died when he was very young, and Kurt had to quit school when he was in high school in order to go to work in order to support himself and his family.
I don't think he had many friends growing up. He spent a lot of time helping on the farm.
Virginia was Kurt's high school sweetheart. Since they married, he's never left her side.
Virginia was a very nice lady. Kurt had a very soft spot in his heart for Virginia.
How you doing? Want some help?
I recall him as a kind of lone wolf, but there were some people who did get along with him.
Kurt Thompson cared for people. If he knew you, he would help you out. If you were a friend of his, he would do almost anything for you. Someone mentioned to Kurt Thompson that his little girl was sick. This was at Christmas time. And a few nights later, he showed up on his front door wearing a Santa suit.
All right, bring something to cheer you up a bit. Hope you're feeling better, okay, honey?
On the other side of the street live Jim and Janet Giesenhagen and their 10-year-old son, Sean. Jim built their house from the ground up, a stone's throw away from his mom, Ardell.
They chose that spot because my grandma lived across the alley, and they just always wanted to stay close. My dad and my grandpa and a few others actually built our house. It always felt like home, you know, because not only was it our house, it actually was our house. We put it there.
Like Kurt, Jim married the love of his life.
My sister Janet had a heart of gold. She loved everybody like they were family. Janet and Jim had a very loving relationship. They were together through everything.
The Giesenhagens were a lovely family. Jim Giesenhagen was a great volunteer, very active in the church. Janet was well regarded in the community and well liked.
As for Sean, he's happiest in the company of Kurt's dog.
My nephew Sean was rambunctious. Sean loved that dog. He went over there and he played with the dog all the time.
I was really young, you know. I like dogs. I'd be friendly.
Sorry about that. It's all right.
He likes dogs.
Okay, thanks.
Who could foresee that such an innocent activity would eventually set off a bloodbath?
Get your hands in the air!
Though they aren't exactly friends, Jim and Janet greet the Thompsons on a daily basis.
Morning.
Their relationship was cordial. They would wave and say hi, and that was about it.
It was just neighbors being neighbors.
As Kurt heads out to work in the coal mine each day, Jim opens up the local repair shop he owns in town.
He was partners in a business. He worked on heaters and air conditioners, but he was jack of all trades. He could do just about anything.
Jim's lucky. He gets to work with his friends, like Joe Tracy.
Joe Tracy just kind of became really close in our family and dependable and very good family friend.
When not minding the store, Jim is all about togetherness. He's a black belt in karate and loves horsing around with his son. All Kurt wants after a long day is to relax and rest up for his next shift in the coal mine. Everyone lives in peace. Until one day when Sean is playing with Kurt's dog, as usual.
I was petting the dog and maybe I grabbed too hard and got bit by the dog.
My sister was upset when Curtis Thompson's dog bit Sean.
When I got home, I just remember telling her what happened. I remember getting in the car and going to the hospital. As moms do, she kind of freaked out.
Janet is scared for her son and angry that Kurt's dog wasn't tied up.
How could you let this happen?
My mom was very, very outspoken, and if she didn't like something, she'd let you know right away. When we got to the hospital, I remember getting stitches.
The bad news is, Sean's wound requires special treatment and numerous doctor examinations. The bill is massive.
My sister thought that Curtis Thompson should reimburse her for the medical attention that Sean had gotten from the doctors.
It seems reasonable enough.
Hey, what's up?
I got the medical bill here from your dog biting my son.
But Kurt sees it differently.
My dog was on my property.
Jim doesn't realize it, but he's just triggered his neighbor's deep well of anger.
Get off my property now.
Kurt.
That was definitely the beginning of the end.
The Giesenhagens will regret the day they dared cross Kurt Thompson.
If you cross Kurt, you now have an enemy for life.
The Giesenhagens were not going to sit idly by without putting up some fight.
You better run, buddy.
I just don't think anybody realized how far it would actually go. I think it happened so fast. Don't actually remember the exact moment.
How could you let this happen?
Kurt Thompson's fury is unleashed on his neighbors, Jim and Janet Giesenhagen, when they demand he foot the bill for his dog biting their son.
Hey, what's up?
I got the,
Instantly, they became Curtis Thompson's enemy.
Get off my property now.
Kurt.
Get.
So what now? What are we supposed to do now?
What's fair to the Giesenhagens is an outrage to Kurt. There's no way he's going to pay their medical bills without a fight.
The Giesenhagens filed a civil lawsuit for damages against Kurt Thompson.
I don't think it was a vindictive or a vendetta move. I think it was just your problem, just take care of it and all's good.
The Giesenhagens also feel they deserve payment for punitive damages and lawyer fees. Their lawsuit asks for $15,000. It's a lot of money for a coal miner.
Kurt had problems with people whom he felt slighted him or offended him in some way. I think he took an outsized view of these slights.
Despite the bite marks on Sean's face, the court sides with Kurt.
The judge was in favor of Curtis Thompson because the dog was in Curtis Thompson's yard.
I know that you like playing with the dog, but I don't want you going over there anymore.
Okay, then.
Stay away from him, too.
Jim and Janet are unhappy with the decision, but they're ready to put it all behind them.
I think they just tried to move on with their everyday life.
But Kurt's not about to forgive and forget the losses he suffered at the hands of the family across the street.
Kurt Thompson had to spend money to hire an attorney to defend him on something that he didn't feel like he was responsible for. I've heard $20,000, I've heard $30,000. It wouldn't have mattered if it was $10. Kurt Thompson still would have resented it.
And his most bitter loss means a lot more to Kurt than just money.
I remember hearing that he had to put the dog down after it bit me.
Ever since then, Curtis Thompson had a vendetta.
I would say the shift in behavior was instant. It just felt different. Just a feeling you get when something's not the same or not right.
Hey, get out of here!
I'm getting the mail.
Get the hell out of here!
Kurt can't seem to shake his grudge.
They made an enemy for life in Kurt Thompson.
Suddenly, the lone wolf across the street is showing his teeth. He starts following Jim through town in his truck.
After I was bitten by Kurt's dog, it seemed like the harassment was constant. When he would follow my dad, it was just always a reminder of what happened. You know, we wanted to move on and he wanted to stay in the past.
He would just glare and give them real dirty, mean looks.
Kurt's always had a temper. But now he's in a constant state of rage, lashing out at people all over town.
Hey, you! Huh? You! Always somebody looking for trouble, isn't there?
Kurt had a reputation around town just being a natural bully. He had no problem, you know, being mean to people.
And I started hearing stories from people around town that he threatened people. He actually got in some physical confrontations with a few people.
Get out!
Some of those stories included him beating up a man at a car dealership. There was a story about him getting in a fist fight with a guy at a school ball game.
Did I ask you to come to my place?
There had been a report of him chasing a guy down the street once.
Keep going! Got it?
People didn't want to deal with Kurt because of his unusual, erratic behavior, and they understandably avoided him.
Normally, people would band together and deal with the problem, but when it came to somebody who they considered on the fringe of crazy, the community didn't band together. They just decided to ignore this one. They were afraid if they reported him that they would go on to his hate list.
We'd try and avoid that side of the street. Even if we had to walk extra, it was just easier than having to deal with the possibility of running into him. It was like you just wanted to put a caution strip around the whole area and just know to stay away.
The more aggressive Kurt gets, the more his wife, Virginia, shrinks from view. We almost never see her. Years go by, and nothing changes. Kurt still considers the Giesenhagens enemies because of the dog bite incident.
It definitely scared me. He just had that look that was just worrisome.
Sorry, don't worry.
But Janet needs to collect her mail, and at 5 months pregnant, she's more vulnerable than ever.
She was very scared, very scared.
She was just going to get the mail one time, and all of our mailboxes were actually right in front of his property.
Hey, you!
Kurt chased my mom with a baseball bat and then stopped and went back to his house. I think it was just a fear tactic. You know, your area's over there, not over here.
It takes the physical threat of Kurt Thompson to a whole new level.
Janet told me about him chasing her with the baseball bat. She was pregnant with Ashley, so she then became very afraid of him.
Jim and Janet are conflicted. Do they report Kurt to the authorities? Poking the bear could just make matters worse.
I think there was definitely a feeling within my parents that, you know, if they tried to push the issue, that it could be a lot worse. And I think they were just trying to keep it as calm as possible.
But they live in fear of Kurt's inevitable next act of intimidation.
On the day that Ashley was born was the best day of my sister and brother-in-law's life, especially my brother-in-law Jim, because he always wanted a daughter. Ashley was the apple of his eye.
While Jim and Janet and their friends gather to celebrate the arrival of baby Ashley, Kurt makes sure they know he hasn't forgotten their feud.
It was basically him saying, still here, you didn't get rid of me, you're not gonna get rid of me. Like, I'd get goosebumps and just natural fear.
It looks like Kurt Thompson will never let his neighbors live in peace.
Stay away from my family.
Mr. Thompson wasn't used to people that wouldn't back away from him.
What the hell's the problem? Something inside me said something bad's gonna happen.
Hey, get out of here.
Sometimes a neighbor next door can be a neighbor from hell.
Yeah, you better run, buddy.
Everybody knew that Kurt had a short fuse and a bad temper. He would pick a fight, or he wouldn't back away from a fight at any time. "13
long years have passed since the dog bite incident. But Kurt Thompson's campaign of fear and intimidation against the Giesenhagens continues to haunt our neighborhood.
I just thought he was this weird guy that lived across the street. I didn't want to go near him. He didn't have to say anything. I just didn't want to be around him. I was scared of him. I was told if Kurt Thompson was ever around to go inside.
Come on, honey.
Just get to someplace safe. Because they weren't sure whether or not he was going to do anything to me. No one had any idea what he was capable of.
Kurt's temper has worsened through the years, and it's just cost him his job at the mine.
Thompson had been fired 9 times, but had to be rehired 8 times because he knew the union contract better than the union knew it and better than the company officials knew it.
It's another blow that fuels Kurt's perpetual rage against the Giesenhagens. And the whole town has to suffer his legendary hate stare.
The stare that Mr. Thompson had was just very piercing eyes, just a very stern, menacing look on his face.
It was very clear what he was conveying through his eyes and through his demeanor. And it was very frightening, even to an adult.
The problem is, no one in Toulon is willing to stand up to him.
My job is very difficult because he would do things to people, but no one would ever want to sign a complaint and go into court. They were all afraid of Mr. Thompson's reputation.
It means the town bully is free to turn up his scare tactics at will. Sean's living on his own now, but Kurt tracks him down at work.
Kurt Thompson would follow me in his truck when I was a cart pusher. He would kind of just creep around corners, and he would just follow me wherever I went. I just felt trapped everywhere I went. It sucked.
That idiot still hasn't left me alone. I don't even know what to do anymore.
The fact that one of Sean's co-workers is Kurt's wife, Virginia, only makes things more tense.
I remember waking up on days and going, okay, what's gonna happen today?
I don't remember there being any good times with Kurt Thompson at all. Things kind of escalated when I was in 4th grade. My mom didn't want me walking by myself to school, so she walked with me. We were coming to a corner and getting ready to stop and cross the street.
Curtis Thompson came at him with the truck. She didn't think he was going to stop.
I thought we were going to get hit. It's almost like he wanted to show us that he could have control over us.
This is getting serious. We need to do something. I'm not letting him chase us away from here.
The Giesenhagens are pushed to the limit.
Afraid.
It was kind of starting to get crazy.
We can't leave my mother here alone. The reason we built this house is to be close to her.
My sister just wanted to move out of Toulon, and she became very frightened of him, very scared.
I remember my mom and dad talking extensively on the fear there could be a violent outcome.
Despite their grave concerns, they refuse to let anyone chase them away from their home.
They were trying to stand their ground and trying to stick up for themselves.
Jim and Janet vow to do all they can to keep their little girl safe.
After almost getting hit by Kurt Thompson, I was always driven to school. He'd follow us the entire way there. It definitely made me feel afraid and worried that something was gonna happen.
There's only so much torment a family can take. Jim's mother, Ardell, refuses to stand by and let Kurt destroy the neighborhood she's lived in her entire life.
At that time, Ardell just had had enough, and she stood up to him.
Kurt Thompson, stay away from my family.
It's the last thing a bully expects.
Mr. Thompson wasn't used to people that wouldn't bow down to him or back away from him.
I'm not afraid of you.
I'm gonna kill all of you one of these days.
Kurt threatened to kill my mom, my dad, my grandma. He was a mean son of a.
It's terrifying for the whole family. And after years of implied threats, Kurt's finally given the Giesenhagens a reason to call the police. Ardell provides a passionate written statement.
How long are we going to allow one man to terrorize the community? I just keep praying for our safety and for the right thing to be done, and stop this nonsense before someone gets hurt bad or killed.
But once again, their efforts to get help are stonewalled.
You've got to do something. They took their complaints to the state's attorney, and they did nothing. They told them to stay in their own yard, avoid him, like they told many people in the town. That's Curtis Thompson. Just stay away from him.
In our society, fear is not illegal. You can be scared of someone, but without an actual physical action. There's supposedly nothing that law enforcement can do.
For the Giesenhagens, living in constant dread is like no life at all.
Things got so bad that they did feel trapped in their own home.
Is he there?
No. No sign of him. Let's go.
I almost felt like I couldn't get away. It was very hard to go do anything without being worried about him following you or worried that he might do something.
There wasn't a lot of steps that my mom and dad could take.
Jim was worried because although Jim was a black belt in karate, he knew that Curtis Thompson also had weapons and a temper. Jim was afraid that Curtis was very capable of killing them.
And it's not just the Giesenhagens who feel his wrath. Kurt Thompson has widened his circle of hate to include Jim's friend and co-worker, Joe Tracy.
What's going on? What do you want?
Once Mr. Thompson became upset with the Giesenhagens, Joe became the enemy.
What begins as a low-level encounter in town becomes a frightening ordeal on a quiet country road.
In the the southern part of Stark County. Joe Tracy drove past Kurt Thompson. Kurt Thompson followed him, passed his van in his truck, and then pulled the truck across the road so that Joe could not pass.
Joe definitely wasn't one to back down.
What the hell's the problem?
Kurt Thompson got out of the truck and threatened Joe Tracy with a claw hammer.
I'm gonna beat the living crap out of you.
A confrontation between two men on a deserted back road is about to trigger a chain of events that will ignite a powder keg of violence.
People of Toulon were in shock.
I just don't know why it had to come to this.
This kind of thing had never happened in Stark County before.
For exclusive footage, go to investigationdiscovery.com.
What the hell's the problem?
Kurt Thompson not only hated everyone in the Giesenhagen family, he hated everyone who worked for them or had any association with them or was friends with them.
Kurt's hate is erupting and spreading. He confronts Jim Giesenhagen's best friend, Joe Tracy, on a country road outside Toulon.
Curtis Thompson came after Joe Tracy with a hammer.
I'm gonna beat the living crap out of you.
Kurt chases Joe for miles before finally veering off. None of us knew if he was just sending a message or starting to lose control.
When I look back now, there were definitely signs that things were getting worse and there was going to be a bad ending.
Unlike most folks in town, Joe is willing to stand up to Kurt and go on the record.
I'm done with it.
He reported that incident to the Stark County Sheriff, and charges of assault were filed by the Stark County State's Attorney.
The sheriff arrests Kurt at his home. And the Giesenhagens believe this is finally the thing that will put the bully behind bars.
Janet and Jim made statements on Joe Tracy's behalf about how dangerous he was.
But the system lets them down again. The court only finds their neighbor guilty of a misdemeanor assault. He's fined a mere $116 plus court costs.
Kurt Thompson was placed on probation for a period of 24 months, and he was ordered to have no contact with the Giesenhagen family and no contact with Joe Tracy or his family.
A restraining order is nothing to a man like Kurt Thompson.
It made his hatred grow. Kurt was a ticking time bomb.
If anything, he redoubles his intimidation tactics, circling the Giesenhagen home day and night like a shark.
I felt very trapped at home, and I was anxious because I wanted to be able to go out and go across the street to my friend's house. And then when all that started, I couldn't. And I remember being angry, scared, anxious. Things were escalating very fast.
Jim and Janet are desperate for help. We started to wonder, are they desperate enough to take matters into their own hands?
I remember my dad putting up like a security camera on the garage. They sensed there was potential for violence. Everybody was expecting him to crack. They wanted something done about it before it happened.
My dad captured footage several times of Kurt going up and down the driveway and in the alley.
I see the footage. It's quite...
The couple hopes the footage will spur police into action.
Make me feel safe.
Technically, he's not breaking the law.
Nothing was ever done because they told us it was a public transportation route.
There's nothing that you can do.
No, he's not on your property.
Kurt Thompson knew how to push the envelope to its very limits.
My parents were disgusted that our police force did absolutely nothing. I think the police were actually scared I think they thought that there would be a snapback on them.
In dealing with Mr. Thompson, I was never in fear of him, but I was always at a heightened awareness. Always the nagging little voice, don't turn your back on him.
Jim and Janet try everything, but cannot convince authorities their family is in imminent danger.
My mom and dad were very discouraged.
It was very frustrating because they knew that things were escalating and he was going to snap. He was going to snap any moment.
Finally, on a cold spring evening, everyone's worst fears are realized.
On March 22nd, 2002, I remember it just being any other day.
Good night, Sean.
My parents were supposed to be going out with Joe, Tracy, out for pizza, like every Friday. My mom was actually sick, and they decided not to go.
We decided just to stay in and watch movies, and I believe my mom had a cold, so we didn't really want to have to go anywhere.
Across the way at Kurt Thompson's house, everything is likewise unremarkable, until a squad car from the Stark County Sheriff's Office shows up. 23-year-old Adam Stryker is on duty. He's a new deputy sheriff who's only been on the job a few months.
There's no one that didn't like Adam. He just had that big smile and a heart of gold.
That's all he ever dreamt, you know, his whole life was to be a police officer and to help the communities that he, you know, worked and lived in. It wasn't such a bad deal to get pulled over by Deputy Stryker because he always was very nice and polite.
Adam was the only deputy on duty in Stark County for the whole county. Adam seen there was warrants that needed to be delivered.
One of the outstanding warrants has been buried in the files of the sheriff's office for over 5 months. It seems Kurt Thompson still hasn't paid his fine for his threats against Joe Tracy.
Kurt Thompson failed to appear in court. The judge then issued a warrant for his arrest.
Adam didn't know Kurt Thompson. He didn't know his reputation. It's a 60-year-old man. Just a $100 fine is all he owed. I don't believe he thought anything about it.
Deputy Stryker knocked on the door. Kurt Thompson came to the door. Deputy Stryker told him, "You're under arrest. There's been a warrant that's been issued for your arrest."
What happens next plunges our town into an abyss, scarring all of us to this day.
He backed up into the house. He reached for his sawed-off shotgun. He pointed it at Deputy Adam Stryker. Thompson fired the shotgun.
Kurt Thompson shot and killed my brother at point-blank range.
After years of barely contained murder threats, Kurt has finally tasted blood. Now he's on a mission to spill more.
Kurt Thompson kicked my brother to see if he was still alive, and then took his 9mm gun off of his hip, proceeded to get in my brother's squad car.
He's ready to cross some names off his hate list, and he won't be satisfied until his #1 enemies are eradicated.
And then that's when he kicked in our door.
It was a tragic, horrible event.
I remember Kurt looking at me with just this blank look.
Kurt Thompson was a loaded gun waiting to go off.
It was like something you see on TV. It wasn't something that happens to you or your family.
After gunning down Stark County Deputy Sheriff Adam Stryker for serving him an arrest warrant, Kurt Thompson is in a murderous rage. He now sets his sights on the Giesenhagens, his neighbors and nemesis for almost 16 years.
Kurt was just lashing out at the world around him and wanted to get even with the people he thought had wronged him.
For a family enjoying a quiet Friday night at home, there's no warning of what's to come.
I remember my dad was going to go down to the basement for something, and I just remember wanting to go down there to help.
Kurt Thompson got out of that Stark County squad car with his sawed-off shotgun in hand.
And then that's when he kicked in our door.
Once inside, Kurt enacts his merciless revenge.
I just remember hearing a loud crack.
Kurt Thompson shot Jim Giesenhagen, killing him almost instantly.
I remember Kurt looking at me with just this blank look. He just had a blank expression on his face. I remember just seeing my dad laying there. Lots of blood. Even being a little kid, you knew when you saw that much blood and you saw somebody just laying there not moving, that something was seriously wrong. And I had this gut feeling that he wasn't gonna be waking up. And then I just waited until I thought he was gone. And then that's when I finally went upstairs and saw my mom in the kitchen.
Bleeding out from a shotgun wound, Janet fights for her life in front of her 10-year-old daughter.
I just remember her laying there. She was trying to talk to me, and I was trying to keep her conscious. And then all she asked for was a pillow, so I gave her a pillow and helped her put it underneath her head, and then I remember calling my grandma.
Hurry! I'll be right there. I'll be right there. Hang on.
I love you, Mommy. You too. I know you.
Kurt has left a blood-spattered slaughterhouse in his wake.
After shooting Jim and Janet Giesenhagen, Kurt Thompson got back into the Stark County squad car belonging to Deputy Adam Stryker. He left the red lights flashing and he began driving around town. He drove through the alley behind Joe Tracy's house. Fortunately, Joe Tracy and his family were not home that evening.
By now, terrified neighbors have called the police, and they're out in full force, looking for a killer on the rampage.
This was a surreal setting for a town like Toulon, and might have been more natural on the main streets of Chicago.
In a place of this size, it's mere minutes before police track down the stolen squad car with Kurt Thompson at the wheel.
A police officer decided to block Thompson in the vehicle he was driving, and I pulled up behind him and boxed his car in.
Kurt, drop your weapons, get your hands in the air!
There was a very loud gunshot. I noticed something stinging my face and realized shots were being fired at me.
Taylor returns Thompson's fire in a deadly shootout.
It was the first time and only time in my career that I'd been involved in a shootout situation. And everything seemed to happen in slow motion.
Gunfire blazes until there's no movement in the hijacked squad car.
I didn't know if Thompson might have been playing possum and was faking being injured. We rushed the car and pulled Mr. Thompson out from behind the wheel, and we did note that he did have a gunshot wound.
Minutes later, a rescue helicopter lands on the Stark County High School football field.
Janet Giesenhagen was transported to that location and loaded on the Life Flight helicopter. As she suffered a shotgun blast to the upper chest, she had thrown her hand up. The shotgun blast had come through her wrist and virtually severed her left hand at the wrist. Kurt Thompson was loaded on the Life Flight helicopter as well.
Sadly, Kurt Thompson is the only injured passenger to survive.
Unfortunately, Janet Giesenhagen died during that flight and was dead upon arrival in Peoria.
They told me on the phone that they're both gone. I just remember falling to my knees and my husband picking me up and holding me and weeping as well. We both wept in each other's arms.
I don't know if you can actually explain the feelings that were going through my mind when I first heard. I remember the first cop I seen, I couldn't even tell you who it was, but looking at him and going, I hope you're happy, this is all your fault. My blame was completely on the Tejon Police Department.
Homemade signs in the windows of the local newspaper speak to the horror and anguish that shroud the town.
This was a pretty sad day in the history of Tejon. The community was in shock, and shock later changed to anger and grief.
All of us should have done more to prevent this terrible tragedy.
For the family of Deputy Sheriff Adam Stryker, who was simply doing his job, there is only the memory of a boy who always knew what he wanted to be.
We'll never have closure. Every day I remember something that Adam said or did or ate or liked or watched.
One thing that, I think people need to realize is that, my brother was getting paid $10 an hour to serve the community. And Adam was doing it because he loved what he did. And he loved helping people. And my brother didn't deserve this.
Facing 3 counts of first-degree murder, Kurt Thompson shows no remorse during his trial.
He would stare at us the entire time. Anytime he would look at Virginia, he would give her a thumbs up like everything's gonna be okay and I'll get out of this.
But the killer's insanity plea falls flat. He's found guilty of all the homicides.
When the judge read that he sentenced him to death, all of us family members, the Giesenhagens and the Strykers, we all stood together with our thumbs up that you didn't get away with it, Kurt Thompson.
After the trial, Virginia Thompson was diagnosed with terminal cancer. She died in 2008 while Kurt Thompson was on death row. So 2 days after he received the news, Kurt Thompson hanged himself in his cell.
For Jim and Janet's...
The desert was quiet that night. Too quiet. The kind of silence that settles over the Arizona desert after midnight, when the highways empty out, the neon signs go dark, and the wind drags dust across endless stretches of cracked earth. Somewhere beyond the dim glow of a roadside gas station, under a sky scattered with cold stars, something happened that no one could fully explain for the next 27 years. It began with a car. At 2:13 a.m., a passing truck driver noticed it pulled halfway off a narrow county road outside a small desert town. The engine was off. The headlights were still on. One door hung open into the darkness. At first glance it looked like a breakdown, the kind of thing that happened often in the empty stretches of Arizona highways. But there was no driver. No movement. No sound except wind. Inside the car sat a half-finished cup of coffee in the holder. The radio hummed faintly with static. A purse rested on the passenger seat. The keys were gone. And the woman who owned the car had vanished. By sunrise the next morning, word had already spread through the small community like wildfire. Police tape fluttered along the roadside. Deputies combed the desert brush step by step, boots crunching over dry gravel, searching for footprints, scraps of clothing, anything that might explain what had happened during those silent minutes in the desert. They found almost nothing. Just a set of tire marks that seemed to appear beside the car and then disappear again into the hard-packed dirt. The missing woman was 26 years old. She had grown up in the town. Everyone knew her face. She worked long shifts, saved money, helped her parents on weekends. Friends described her as careful, cautious, not the type to disappear into the desert in the middle of the night. And yet somehow she had. Within hours the local sheriff's office launched a full search operation. Volunteers lined the dusty roads, scanning the horizon. Helicopters circled low above the cactus fields. Deputies knocked on doors asking the same question over and over again. Did you see her? Did you see anyone near the road last night? Did you hear anything unusual? Most people hadn't. But one witness remembered something strange. A resident who lived nearly a mile away told investigators he had been awake late that night watching television when he heard the distant roar of a vehicle accelerating hard down the road. Not just driving, speeding. The kind of reckless burst of speed that makes people glance out their windows. He didn't see the vehicle clearly. Just headlights slicing through the darkness and then disappearing. At the time, no one thought much of it. Arizona highways were full of late-night drivers. Still, investigators wrote it down. Another detail surfaced soon after. Earlier that evening, several people had seen the missing woman at a small diner along the highway. She had stopped for coffee before heading home. Waitresses remembered her clearly because she had joked about being exhausted after a long shift. She left around midnight. Smiling. Nothing seemed wrong. Security cameras in the diner parking lot caught her walking to her car, unlocking the door, climbing in, and driving away into the quiet desert road. That was the last confirmed moment anyone ever saw her alive. The timeline narrowed quickly. Between midnight and roughly 2 in the morning, something had happened along that lonely stretch of road. Detectives searched the abandoned car inch by inch. Fingerprints dusted across the dashboard. Fibers collected from the seats. The trunk opened and inspected under bright evidence lights. There were no signs of a struggle inside. No broken glass. No blood. Just the eerie stillness of a vehicle that looked as if the driver had simply stepped out and vanished into the night. Yet one small detail bothered investigators from the beginning. The driver's door. It was open wider than someone would normally leave it if they were stepping out briefly. Not flung wide in panic but not casually closed either. Half open. As if someone had interrupted her. The first theory was a breakdown followed by an encounter with a passing stranger. Maybe she had pulled over for help. Maybe someone had stopped. But mechanics later confirmed the car had nothing wrong with it. The engine worked perfectly. Gas tank half full. Battery fine. There had been no reason to stop. Days passed. Search teams expanded outward into the desert hills. Volunteers walked mile after mile across scorching terrain, peering into dry ravines and abandoned mine shafts. Police dogs tracked scent trails that faded into nothing after a few hundred yards. No footprints. No clothing. No body. The desert kept it secret. The disappearance shocked the town in a way few crimes ever had. This was not a large city where tragedies disappeared into the daily churn of headlines. This was a tight community where people left their doors unlocked and recognized each other's trucks from a distance. Now fear crept quietly into everyday life. Parents began driving their daughters to work. Gas stations closed earlier at night. Conversations in grocery store aisles circled back to the same uneasy question. How does someone vanish from the side of a road without leaving a trace? Weeks turned into months. Detectives chased dozens of leads. Tips poured in from across the state. A hitchhiker seen near the highway. A suspicious van parked outside the diner days earlier. A man reported arguing loudly at a nearby motel. Each clue sparked brief hope. Each one collapsed under scrutiny. No physical evidence tied anyone to the scene. Then investigators discovered something that deepened the mystery. A second set of tire impressions had been partially preserved in the dirt beside the missing woman's car. At first they were dismissed as unrelated marks left by other vehicles. But a forensic technician studying photographs noticed something unusual about the pattern. The tires appeared to have pulled up beside the car, paused and then accelerated away sharply. As if someone had stopped. And then left quickly. Unfortunately, the impressions were too degraded to match to a specific vehicle. Another lead faded. By the end of the first year, the case had begun its slow descent into uncertainty. Files stacked up on investigators' desks. Interviews were typed, catalogued, archived. Maps of the search areas were rolled into tubes and stored away. The town continued living its life, but the story never fully disappeared. Every anniversary of the disappearance brought the same uneasy headlines. Mystery in the desert. Local woman still missing. Police ask public for new tips. But no new tips came. The road where the car had been found returned to its usual quiet routine. Trucks rumbled past at night. Dust drifted across the asphalt. The wind erased the last faint signs of police tape that once fluttered there. Years passed. 5. 10. 15. Detectives retired. Evidence boxes gathered dust in storage rooms deep inside the sheriff's department building. New crimes demanded attention, pushing old mysteries further into the background. The case had a name now. A cold case. One of many unsolved disappearances scattered across the American desert. And like so many cold cases, it seemed destined to remain exactly that. Until one night, decades later, when a detective reviewing long-forgotten evidence noticed something no one else had ever truly understood. Something small. Something overlooked. A piece of evidence that had been sitting quietly in storage since 1997. Forgotten. Ignored. Waiting. And when that evidence was finally examined again under modern forensic technology, it would trigger a chain reaction no one in the town could have imagined. Because 27 years after a woman vanished beside a silent desert road, investigators were about to discover that someone had been hiding the truth in plain sight all along. And the arrest that followed would come suddenly. Late at night. Without warning. In a quiet neighborhood where neighbors had no idea they were living beside the shadow of one of Arizona's most haunting cold cases. For years the evidence sat untouched. Inside a climate-controlled storage room at the county sheriff's office, shelves groaned under the weight of cardboard boxes, each one labeled with fading black marker, each one containing fragments of stories that had never reached an ending. Burglary files. Missing persons reports. Old homicide investigations whose trails had gone cold under the relentless desert sun. Among them was a single box stamped with a case number from 1997. The file was thick. Too thick for a disappearance that had produced so little evidence. Photographs. Interview transcripts. Maps. Forensic reports typed on aging computers that printed their words in faded dot matrix ink. Every page told the same frustrating story, dozens of questions, almost no answers. For nearly 3 decades, the case existed in a kind of suspended silence. Detectives came and went. Some studied the file briefly, hoping to see what earlier investigators had missed. Most closed it again within hours. The problem was simple. There was nothing to work with. No body. No confirmed suspect. No weapon. No eyewitness who could place someone at the roadside when the woman vanished. Just a car abandoned under the stars and a stretch of desert that seemed determined to swallow the truth forever. But time has a strange way of shifting old mysteries. In 2024, a detective assigned to the department's cold case unit began reviewing files scheduled for digital archiving. It was tedious work. Hours spent scanning aging documents and cataloging evidence that had not been touched in decades. Late one afternoon, the detective opened the 1997 disappearance file. He had heard of the case before. Everyone in the department had. It was the kind of story veteran deputies mentioned quietly over coffee, the roadside mystery that had haunted the town for years. Still, he didn't expect to find anything new. The original investigators had been thorough. They had chased every lead available in the late 1990s. And at the time, forensic technology had already examined the car carefully. But as the detective flipped through the pages, one detail caught his attention. A short note in the evidence log. 3 words typed in small letters beside a numbered entry. Partial latent print. He paused. Fingerprints had been collected from the vehicle, of course. That was standard procedure. Most had been explained: prints belonging to the missing woman, the diner waitress who handed her coffee, mechanics who had serviced the car months earlier. But this entry was different. The print had been found on the outer frame of the driver's door. And the report stated something strange. It did not match anyone in the original investigation. At the time, investigators had checked it against the limited fingerprint databases available in the late 90s. Nothing came back. So the print had been catalogued, sealed in an evidence envelope and quietly forgotten. The detective leaned back in his chair. Technology had changed dramatically since 1997. Fingerprint databases had grown exponentially. Millions of new entries. Digital comparison systems capable of detecting matches that earlier programs could never find. Suddenly the old evidence log didn't look quite so unremarkable. He requested the envelope. An evidence technician retrieved it from storage the next morning. The packaging was yellowed with age but still intact, sealed with tape that bore the initials of the original crime lab analyst. Inside was a small transparent sheet containing the partial print lifted from the door frame. A ghostly swirl of ridges. Not perfect, but potentially enough. The detective submitted the print for modern analysis. At first, nothing happened. Weeks passed while the laboratory processed thousands of routine cases. Old cold case evidence rarely moved to the front of the line. There were more urgent crimes demanding attention. Then, one afternoon, the call came. A technician's voice crackled through the phone. They had a match. The detective felt a cold rush of adrenaline. The fingerprint belonged to a man now living less than 60 miles away. His name had never appeared anywhere in the original investigation. Not once. Which raised a disturbing question. How had his fingerprint ended up on the driver's door of a missing woman's car at 2 in the morning in 1997? The man was 58 years old now. Back then he had been in his early 30s. A local construction worker. According to public records, he had lived in the region for most of his life. He had no major criminal record, just a few minor arrests decades earlier, nothing violent, nothing that would have drawn attention during the original investigation. In other words, he had blended perfectly into the background. The detective began digging deeper. Employment history. Vehicle registrations. Addresses going back to the mid-1990s. And then another detail surfaced. In 1997, the man had owned a pickup truck. A truck with a specific type of tire. The kind investigators had noted, vaguely, frustratingly, in the original photographs taken beside the abandoned car. The old tire impressions had never been clear enough for a positive match. But the pattern described in the report looked similar. Very similar. The detective's pulse quickened. A fingerprint. A vehicle possibly consistent with the tire marks. And a man who had somehow escaped notice for 27 years. Still, one fingerprint alone was not enough. Investigators needed more. They began quietly reconstructing the man's life during the months surrounding the disappearance. Old utility bills. Employment schedules. Statements from co-workers who barely remembered that far back. One former co-worker recalled something odd. He remembered the man arriving late to work one morning in the late 90s, appearing shaken and unusually quiet. At the time, no one asked questions. Construction crews worked long hours, and exhaustion was common. But now, with decades of distance, the memory felt different. Uneasy. Detectives also learned something else. The man had lived less than 15 miles from the roadside where the car was discovered. A straight drive along the same highway the missing woman would have taken home from the diner. Investigators moved cautiously. They could not alert the suspect too early. Instead, they began surveillance. Unmarked vehicles parked quietly along his street. Detectives watched as the man followed the ordinary rhythm of suburban life, leaving home each morning, returning in the evening, mowing his lawn on weekends. To neighbors he appeared completely normal. Quiet. Friendly. The kind of person who waved politely when passing on the sidewalk. No one around him had any idea that detectives were watching his house because of a mystery buried deep in the desert nearly 3 decades earlier. Meanwhile, forensic teams reopened the rest of the evidence. The purse recovered from the passenger seat. Clothing fibers found on the driver's seat. A paper coffee cup still sealed inside an evidence bag. Technology that did not exist in 1997 could now analyze microscopic traces investigators once overlooked. And slowly, piece by piece, the past began to stir. Because buried inside those aging evidence bags was something else. Something the original investigators had collected but never truly understood. A tiny fiber. Barely visible to the naked eye. Clinging to the inside of the car door. At the time, it meant nothing. Now it would become one of the most important clues in the entire case. And as detectives waited for the lab results to return, they began preparing for a possibility that would send shockwaves through the quiet Arizona community. The possibility that the man living peacefully in that suburban house had once stood beside a stranded car under the desert stars. And that whatever happened on that road in 1997 had followed him silently through every year of his life since. Waiting. Just like the evidence box. Waiting for someone to finally open it. The fiber was so small it could have been mistaken for dust. When the evidence technician first removed the sealed bag from storage, the contents looked almost insignificant under the fluorescent lights of the lab. A strip of adhesive tape used decades earlier to lift trace material from the driver's side door. Several tiny particles trapped beneath the plastic surface. Specks collected quickly during the chaos of the original investigation. In 1997, forensic science had its limits. Investigators focused on fingerprints, blood, obvious physical traces. Fibers were collected, catalogued, photographed, yet most of the time they led nowhere. There simply weren't enough reference databases, not enough precision to tell investigators exactly where a microscopic strand might have come from. So the fiber from the car door had been labeled, logged, and quietly sealed away with the rest of the case. Now it was under a microscope again. A forensic analyst leaned closer to the screen as the magnified image came into focus. The fiber wasn't cotton. It wasn't wool. Under polarized light it revealed a distinctive synthetic structure, something manufactured, not natural. She rotated the sample slowly. The color shifted under the light, a faint dull green. Not a color commonly found in clothing. The analyst cross-referenced the fiber against modern textile databases. Within hours a pattern emerged. The fiber was consistent with a specific type of industrial upholstery used during the 1990s. Not from a couch. Not from household furniture. From vehicle interiors. More specifically, from a type of aftermarket seat covers sold widely across the Southwest in the mid-90s. Seat covers popular among pickup truck owners. The same type of truck investigators already suspected might have been present beside the abandoned car. When the analyst delivered her preliminary report, the room inside the sheriff's office fell quiet. Detectives laid the evidence photographs across the table. The old tire impressions from 1997. The fingerprint match from the car door. Now the fiber tied to a vehicle interior. And the suspect's records confirmed something investigators had just discovered. In 1997, his pickup truck had been fitted with aftermarket seat covers. Green ones. The kind sold at auto parts stores across Arizona at the time. Individually, each piece of evidence could still be explained away. A fingerprint might have come from an innocent encounter. A fiber might have transferred accidentally. Tire impressions might match thousands of trucks on the road. But together the pattern was becoming harder to ignore. The detectives needed to know more about the man himself. They started interviewing people who had known him in the late 90s. Old co-workers. Former neighbors. Friends from bars he used to visit after work. At first the stories sounded ordinary. He kept to himself. Worked hard. Drank occasionally. But as conversations continued, subtle details began surfacing. One former co-worker remembered something peculiar about the man's truck. He was obsessive about cleaning it. Every weekend he would vacuum the interior thoroughly, wiping down surfaces with chemical cleaners. At the time it seemed like simple pride in his vehicle. But one detail stuck in the co-worker's memory. The cleaning started suddenly. Right around the same time the woman vanished. Another acquaintance remembered a strange conversation at a bar months after the disappearance. The television above the counter had been showing a local news segment about the unsolved case. The missing woman's photograph filled the screen while reporters discussed the ongoing investigation. Most patrons barely paid attention. But the man detectives were now investigating had reacted differently. He had gone quiet. Very quiet. According to the witness, he stared at the screen for a long moment before finishing his drink and leaving the bar without saying a word. At the time no one thought twice about it. Now the memory felt heavy. Investigators dug further into the man's background. And slowly they discovered something else. In the mid-1990s he had developed a habit of driving late at night. Several acquaintances remembered him mentioning long drives through the desert after work, sometimes for hours. No specific destination. Just endless stretches of highway beneath empty skies. One friend had once joked about it. "Man, what are you doing out there all night? Hunting aliens?" The man had laughed. But he never gave a real answer. Detectives compared old employment records with the timeline of the disappearance. The night the woman vanished, the suspect had not been scheduled for work the following morning. No one could account for his whereabouts after midnight. It was circumstantial. Still circumstantial. But the pieces were tightening around him. Meanwhile, forensic testing continued. The coffee cup found inside the car had been preserved for nearly 3 decades. In 1997 investigators had checked it only for obvious fingerprints. Now advanced DNA recovery techniques allowed scientists to search for traces invisible to earlier methods. The lab carefully processed the cup, swabbing the rim, examining the plastic lid, extracting microscopic biological material that might have survived all these years. The results took weeks. Detectives waited. Outside, the Arizona desert continued its quiet existence. Highways stretched across empty land. Night winds carried dust over the same lonely road where the abandoned car had once been discovered. Most people in the town had long since stopped thinking about the case. A whole generation had grown up without remembering the shock of that morning in 1997. But inside the sheriff's department, the past was slowly clawing its way back into the present. Then the call came from the lab. The voice on the other end of the phone sounded careful. Measured. They had recovered partial DNA from the plastic lid of the coffee cup. The profile was incomplete, but strong enough for comparison. Detectives already knew whose DNA they wanted to check. But they couldn't obtain it directly without alerting the suspect. So they did what investigators often do in cases like this. They waited. Surveillance continued. Officers watched quietly as the man moved through his daily routines, unaware that decades-old evidence was closing in around him. Then one evening, an opportunity appeared. The suspect stopped at a convenience store on his way home. Detectives inside an unmarked vehicle watched from across the parking lot as he stepped out of his truck, walked inside, and returned minutes later holding a bottle of soda. He drank from it while standing beside the truck. Then he tossed the empty bottle into a trash can near the door before driving away. Investigators moved quickly. Within seconds an officer retrieved the bottle from the trash. Bagged it. Tagged it. Sent it straight to the lab. A few days later, the results arrived. The DNA on the discarded bottle matched the partial DNA recovered from the coffee cup inside the missing woman's car. The room inside the sheriff's department went silent. After 27 years of dead ends, investigators finally had something they had never possessed before. A direct forensic connection. The man whose fingerprint had been on the door. The man whose truck matched the tire impressions. The man whose vehicle interior matched the mysterious fiber. Now his DNA was linked to the final item the missing woman had touched before disappearing into the desert night. For the first time since 1997, detectives could finally say something with certainty. The suspect had been there. Standing beside that car. At some point during those silent hours when the highway was empty and the desert wind whispered across the asphalt. What happened next remained unknown. But investigators were now certain of one thing. The man living quietly in that suburban neighborhood had crossed paths with the missing woman during the final moments anyone ever saw her alive. And very soon detectives would be knocking on his door. By the time the DNA report arrived, the investigation had already shifted from quiet curiosity to something far more serious. Inside the sheriff's department conference room, photographs from the original crime scene were spread across the table again. The same images detectives in 1997 had studied under fluorescent lights, grainy shots of a lonely road, tire impressions in pale desert dirt, a sedan sitting under a black sky with one door hanging open into the darkness. But now those photographs look different. Because for the first time, investigators could imagine someone standing there beside the car. Not a stranger who vanished into the wind. Not a faceless silhouette in the distance. A real man. A man with a name, a house, a job, neighbors who waved to him every morning as they drove past. The DNA from the discarded soda bottle had sealed it. His genetic profile matched the partial DNA found on the coffee cup lid inside the vehicle. Which meant one thing. At some point that night in 1997, he had been close enough to the missing woman's car to touch the same object she had just been drinking from. Close enough for his DNA to remain there for nearly 3 decades. Investigators began mapping the timeline again. The diner security camera placed the woman leaving shortly after midnight. She drove onto the same highway she had taken hundreds of times before, a straight stretch of asphalt cutting through miles of desert land before reaching town. Somewhere along that route, within roughly 20 miles, something interrupted her drive. Her car was discovered just after 2 in the morning. Which meant there was a window of less than 2 hours when everything changed. Detectives studied the suspect's background more closely than ever. His life in 1997 had been simple. Construction jobs during the day, occasional nights out at local bars, long solitary drives through the desert after work. He had never been interviewed during the original investigation. Never questioned. never considered a person of interest. It was almost as if he had moved through the edges of the community unseen. But when detectives started interviewing people again, this time asking very specific questions, small, unsettling memories began surfacing. A former neighbor recalled hearing his pickup truck leave the driveway late at night on a regular basis. Another acquaintance remembered the man occasionally talking about lonely desert roads where nobody would hear a thing. At the time, those comments sounded like dark humor. Now they carried a different weight. Investigators also discovered something that had been buried deep in old police records. In 1995, 2 years before the disappearance, a woman had reported a frightening encounter along a nearby highway. She told police a pickup truck had followed her for several miles late at night, pulling up beside her car repeatedly before finally speeding away when she turned toward a gas station. She had never gotten the license plate. But the vehicle description matched something familiar. A dark pickup, with aftermarket seat covers visible through the window. The report had gone nowhere at the time. Just another unsettling roadside incident. Now detectives placed the old report beside the 1997 case file. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Still, the investigation had to proceed carefully. Circumstantial evidence alone would not be enough to make an arrest after so many years. They needed something stronger. Something that could explain not just why the suspect had been near the car but what had happened to the woman after that. The next step came quietly. Detectives obtained a search warrant for the suspect's property. On a cool evening just after sunset, a convoy of unmarked vehicles rolled slowly into the suburban neighborhood where he lived. Most of the houses looked identical, small lawns, mailboxes near the curb, porch lights glowing softly as families ate dinner inside. Neighbors barely noticed the first officers approaching the driveway. But when more vehicles arrived and investigators began moving toward the house, curtains started shifting. People stepped onto porches. Something was happening. Something serious. The suspect opened the door himself. According to officers present that night, he looked confused at first, then cautious. Detectives explained they were reopening an old investigation and had a warrant to search the property. For a brief moment, the man said nothing. Then he stepped aside. The house was quiet inside. Family photographs lined the hallway walls, graduations, holidays, smiling faces frozen in time. A television murmured softly in the living room while investigators began moving through the rooms methodically. They searched closets, storage boxes, the garage, and eventually, the truck parked in the driveway. It was not the same truck he had owned in 1997. That vehicle had been sold years earlier. But detectives examined the current truck anyway, looking for anything unusual. What they found instead came from a different part of the property. Behind the house stood a small metal shed. Weathered. Locked. When investigators opened the door, a smell of old wood and dust drifted out. Inside were stacks of forgotten belongings, tools, boxes of old clothes, camping equipment that looked as though it had not been touched in years. One detective noticed something leaning against the back wall. A rolled piece of fabric. Green. He pulled it forward and unrolled it slowly. The material was faded, brittle with age. But the pattern was unmistakable. It was a seat cover. The same dull green color forensic analysts had identified from the microscopic fiber recovered inside the missing woman's car. For several seconds no one spoke. The cover looked old enough to have come from a vehicle decades earlier. Possibly the same truck the suspect owned in 1997. Investigators carefully collected the fabric as evidence. The suspect watched from the doorway of the shed. His face remained calm. Too calm. When detectives asked where the seat cover came from, he shrugged slightly. Old truck stuff, he said. Nothing more. But something about the way he said it unsettled the investigators standing there. Because by that point, the evidence was beginning to form a chain too strong to ignore. Fingerprint on the door. DNA on the coffee cup. Fiber matching his vehicle interior. And now the physical seat cover itself. The investigation had moved beyond coincidence. Still, one critical question remained unanswered. Where was the missing woman? After 27 years, her body had never been found. Without that final piece of the puzzle, the story remained incomplete. Detectives left the property that night with several boxes of evidence. The suspect was not arrested yet. But the walls were closing in. Forensic teams began analyzing the seat cover in detail, searching for microscopic traces that might connect it directly to the crime scene. Meanwhile, investigators studied satellite maps, property records, and land purchases connected to the suspect during the late 1990s. Because somewhere in the vast Arizona desert there was a place the woman had disappeared to after leaving her car. And detectives were beginning to suspect the man they were watching had known exactly where that place was all along. The desert remembers more than people think. Out there beyond the town limits, where the pavement thins into narrow highways and the land stretches endlessly beneath a white-hot sun, the landscape rarely changes. Cactus stands in the same place for decades. Dry washes cut through the sand exactly where storms carved them years before. Fences lean the same way they always have, rusted wire creaking in the wind. And sometimes, buried beneath all that stillness, the past waits. After the search of the suspect's home, detectives began reconstructing a map of his life during the late 1990s. Old addresses. Job sites. Places he visited often. Roads he might have driven during those long solitary nights when co-workers remembered him disappearing for hours into the desert. They pinned the locations across a large map in the investigation room. At first the pattern looked random. Construction jobs scattered across counties. Temporary rental houses. Bars he used to frequent after work. But one location kept appearing again and again in records from that time period. A stretch of land about 40 miles outside town. Desolate. Dry. A place where the highway faded into a network of dusty dirt roads twisting between low hills and abandoned mining trails. Property records showed that in 1996, just a year before the disappearance, the suspect had briefly leased a small parcel of land in that area. It wasn't much. Just a patch of desert used occasionally for camping and target practice by locals. The lease had lasted less than a year, and afterward the land passed to another owner. But the detail made detectives pause. Because the parcel sat less than 15 miles from the roadside where the missing woman's car had been found. The possibility was chilling. If the suspect had encountered her along that highway in the early hours of the morning, he would have known exactly where to go. A place isolated enough that no one would ever hear what happened next. Detectives began preparing a search operation. Even after nearly 3 decades, investigators sometimes recover remains in desert terrain. The climate preserves evidence differently than humid environments. Bones can survive. Clothing fragments. Personal belongings. The challenge is the size of the landscape. Thousands of acres. Miles of uneven ground. But the detectives had something valuable. Old aerial photographs. Satellite images from the late 1990s. Comparing those images with modern maps, analysts began looking for disturbances in the terrain, subtle changes that might indicate digging or soil displacement long ago. One area caught their attention. Near the center of the leased parcel stood a shallow depression that had not existed in photographs taken 2 years earlier. In the 1998 image, the soil looked darker in a circular patch about 15 feet across. Over time the wind had smoothed the surface again. But the faint scar remained visible from above. 3 days later, just after sunrise, a convoy of sheriff's vehicles rolled slowly down a narrow dirt road toward the site. The landscape was silent. The kind of silence that feels heavy in the chest. Investigators stepped out into dry air already warming under the rising sun. Dust swirled around their boots as they carried equipment toward the marked area. Ground-penetrating radar units were assembled first. The machines swept slowly across the soil, sending signals beneath the surface and translating echoes into shapes on a monitor. For nearly an hour the readings showed nothing unusual. Just layers of compacted earth and scattered rocks. Then the technician paused. A faint irregularity appeared beneath the ground about 4 feet down. Not large, but distinct enough to catch attention. Detectives exchanged quiet glances. Excavation began immediately. Shovels cut into the hardened soil carefully, layer by layer. The desert ground resisted at first, packed tight after decades of heat and wind. But slowly the hole deepened. 2 feet. 3 feet. Then one of the investigators stopped suddenly. He had seen something. A pale shape emerging from the dirt. For a moment no one spoke. The brush of a gloved hand cleared away loose soil. Bone. Human. The search team froze in place as the reality settled over them. After 27 years, the desert had finally given something back. The excavation expanded carefully. Forensic specialists documented every inch of the site before continuing. More bones appeared beneath the soil, fragments first, then the outline of a skeleton curled slightly on one side. Beside it lay pieces of clothing. Faded. Threadbare. But unmistakably belonging to a woman. Investigators also discovered something else buried with the remains. A necklace. Simple. Silver. The missing woman's family had described it years earlier during the first days of the investigation, a small pendant she wore almost every day. The discovery confirmed what everyone standing there already knew. They had found her. Word traveled quickly back to the sheriff's department. And soon after to the town. By that evening, news stations across the region were broadcasting the update. The missing woman whose disappearance had haunted the community since 1997 had finally been located. But the discovery also changed something fundamental about the case. Until that moment, it had technically remained a missing persons investigation. Now it was something else. A homicide. Forensic anthropologists transported the remains to a laboratory for detailed examination. Even after decades underground, bones can reveal the final moments of a victim's life. Fractures. Trauma. Evidence of violence. Meanwhile, detectives returned their attention to the suspect. Surveillance teams watched his house more closely than ever. He still appeared unaware of the developments unfolding miles away in the desert. He mowed his lawn that weekend. Waved to neighbors. Picked up groceries at the same store he always visited. To anyone passing by, life looked perfectly normal. But investigators knew something he didn't. The place where the missing woman had been hidden was now exposed. And soon, forensic analysis would reveal exactly what had happened during those silent hours after her car stopped along the lonely Arizona highway. If the evidence told the story detectives expected, the quiet life the suspect had built over the past 27 years was about to collapse overnight. Because the desert had kept his secret long enough. And now it was finally speaking. The laboratory was quiet the morning the examination began. Inside a secure forensic facility, the remains recovered from the desert lay carefully arranged beneath bright overhead lights. Nearly 3 decades had passed since the woman disappeared, but time had not erased everything. Bones still carried stories if someone knew how to listen. Forensic anthropologists worked slowly, documenting each fragment with photographs and measurements. The process was methodical, respectful. Every detail mattered. Because somewhere within those bones was the final record of what had happened on that empty Arizona highway in 1997. The skeleton was mostly intact. Years underground had protected much of it from animals and erosion. Clothing remnants still clung to parts of the frame, faded denim, fragments of fabric that once formed a shirt. The silver necklace found beside the remains had already confirmed the identity. Dental records matched as well. The missing woman had finally come home. But the investigation was far from finished. Now came the difficult part, determining how she died. The anthropologist leaned closer to the skull, adjusting the light. At first nothing appeared unusual. No obvious fractures along the cranium. No clear signs of blunt force trauma that might indicate a violent blow. But when the cervical vertebrae were examined, the small bones of the neck, something changed. One of the bones showed damage. A fracture. The kind that could occur during severe compression of the throat. The room grew quiet as the team studied the finding. Strangulation. It was not yet a final conclusion, but the pattern was consistent with pressure applied to the neck with significant force. Possibly with hands. Possibly with an object. Either way, it pointed clearly toward homicide. Further examination revealed additional clues. The position of the body suggested the victim had not been buried carefully. Instead, she appeared to have been placed quickly into the shallow grave and covered with soil in haste. One arm lay twisted beneath the torso. The skull angled slightly downward. Not arranged. Not preserved. Just hidden. Which told investigators something important about the moment of burial. Whoever put her there had been in a hurry. Perhaps afraid someone might pass by. Perhaps panicking. Perhaps desperate to erase what had just happened. Meanwhile, detectives were piecing together another timeline back at the sheriff's office. They now knew where the woman had ended up. But what happened between the roadside stop and the shallow grave? The theory forming among investigators was chilling in its simplicity. The suspect had likely encountered her while she was driving home from the diner shortly after midnight. Maybe he had been traveling the same highway. Maybe he saw her car alone on the road. Maybe he pulled alongside, signaled for her to stop. There were many possibilities. But the evidence suggested something clear: she had stopped voluntarily. There were no signs of a crash. No evidence her car had been forced off the road. Instead, the driver's door had been opened partway, as though she had stepped out to speak with someone beside the vehicle. Someone standing close enough to leave a fingerprint on the door frame. Someone close enough to touch the coffee cup she had just been drinking from. The detectives imagined the moment. Two people standing under a dark desert sky. Engines idling. Wind whispering across empty land. Then something went wrong. Perhaps an argument. Perhaps an attempt to force her into the truck. Whatever happened, investigators believed the confrontation turned violent quickly. The fracture in the neck bones suggested intense pressure. Struggling. A desperate fight for air. The location of the body added another disturbing detail. The shallow grave sat deep within the remote parcel the suspect had leased the year before. A place he likely knew well, far from homes or passing traffic. Which meant one thing. He had driven her there. Whether she was alive or already dead at that point remained unclear. But the evidence suggested her car had been abandoned along the highway soon after the encounter. Then the suspect had transported her body, or perhaps a still unconscious victim, into the desert in his truck. Investigators returned to the burial site again days later, searching the surrounding area more thoroughly. Metal detectors swept the ground. Forensic teams sifted through soil carefully, hoping to recover anything that might have been dropped during the hurried burial. They found very little. But one discovery stood out. About 20 feet from the grave, partially buried beneath layers of sand, a small object appeared in the sifting screen. A button. Plain. Dark. For years it had sat unnoticed beneath the desert surface. When analysts examined the clothing recovered with the remains, they noticed something immediately. One of the shirt buttons was missing. The pattern matched. The button found in the sand likely tore loose during the struggle that ended her life. Another silent witness to the violence of that night. Back in town, the discovery of the remains had shaken the community in ways few expected. For nearly 3 decades the disappearance had lived as an unresolved question. Now the answer was real. Painfully real. Flowers appeared along the roadside where the abandoned car had once been discovered. People who remembered the original news reports drove out quietly to stand beside the highway, staring across the same open desert where everything had begun. But the most dramatic moment had not yet come. Inside the sheriff's department, detectives now possessed something they had never had before. A body. Evidence of homicide. Forensic connections linking the suspect to the victim's final moments. And a burial site located in a place the suspect once controlled. The case that had sat frozen since 1997 was suddenly alive again. Arrest warrants began moving through the legal system. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence carefully, assembling the narrative that would eventually be presented in court. Fingerprint. DNA. Fiber. Burial site. Each piece forming part of a chain stretching back nearly 3 decades. But investigators still needed one more moment. One moment where the suspect would have to face the reality that the desert had given up its secret. And that moment would come late at night. In the quiet suburban neighborhood where he had lived peacefully for years. Where porch lights glowed softly. Where neighbors slept unaware that police vehicles were already beginning to gather at the end of the street. Because after 27 years of silence the knock on his door was finally coming. The neighborhood was asleep when the vehicles arrived. It was close to midnight, the kind of hour when suburban streets fall into deep silence. Porch lights glowed dimly over quiet lawns. The hum of distant traffic drifted faintly from the highway miles away. Most houses were dark, curtains drawn, families long since gone to bed. But at the far end of the block, shadows moved. Unmarked SUVs rolled slowly along the curb, headlights dimmed. Engines idled low as doors opened carefully. Detectives stepped out one by one, their movements deliberate, controlled. No sirens. No flashing lights. Just quiet footsteps moving toward a single house. For weeks investigators had watched this moment approaching, assembling evidence piece by piece until the story was clear enough to act. The fingerprint from the car door. The DNA on the coffee cup. The microscopic fiber. The buried remains in the desert. 27 years of silence now pointed directly at the man sleeping inside. The arrest warrant sat folded in the lead detective's hand. He glanced once more toward the house. A modest place. White siding. A pickup truck parked in the driveway. Nothing about it suggested the weight of the secret investigators believed lived inside those walls. 2 officers moved to the back of the property. Another stood beside the garage. The rest approached the front door. For a moment the street felt frozen in time. Then the knock came. 3 sharp hits against the wood. Inside the house, movement stirred. A light flicked on somewhere deeper in the hallway. Footsteps approached slowly. Another knock. Sheriff's department. The footsteps stopped. For a long second nothing happened. Then the door opened. The man standing in the doorway looked older than the photographs investigators had studied from decades earlier. Grey hair now lined his temples. The weight of years showed in the creases of his face. But his eyes were alert. Sharp. The detective spoke calmly. "We have a warrant for your arrest." The words hung in the night air. Behind the suspect, the hallway light cast a pale glow across family photographs mounted along the wall. Birthdays, graduations, quiet moments captured over the years of a life that had appeared perfectly ordinary. The suspect didn't speak immediately. He looked past the detectives for a moment, as if trying to understand how many officers stood outside. Then his gaze returned to the warrant. "What for?" he asked. The detective held his eyes. "For the murder of a woman who disappeared in 1997. For the first time, something shifted across the man's face. Not shock. Not outrage. Something quieter. Something closer to recognition. Officers stepped forward and placed him in handcuffs. Inside nearby homes, porch lights began flicking on as neighbors noticed movement in the street. Curtains parted. A door opened across the road as someone stepped outside, confused by the sight of police vehicles lining the curb. The suspect was guided toward one of the waiting SUVs. No resistance. No shouting. Just silence. But inside the vehicle, as the door closed and the engine started, the weight of what was happening finally began to settle over the investigation. The cold case that had haunted the town for nearly 3 decades had just produced its first arrest. News spread before sunrise. By morning, reporters had gathered outside the sheriff's department building. Camera crews aimed their lenses at the entrance as detectives moved quietly through the doors, carrying folders thick with evidence. The headline appeared across local news stations within hours. Arizona 1997 cold case, suspect arrested after 27 years. For many residents of the town, the announcement felt surreal. Some remembered the original disappearance clearly, the abandoned car, the search helicopters circling above the desert, the uneasy silence that followed when weeks passed without answers. Others had only heard the story growing up, told quietly by parents or teachers as one of those strange local mysteries that never seemed to end. Now suddenly, it had. Or at least it was beginning to. Inside an interrogation room at the sheriff's office, the suspect sat alone at a metal table. A recorder blinked red in the center of the room. The walls were plain. Windowless. Detectives entered quietly and took seats across from him. For several minutes no one spoke. The suspect stared down at his hands resting on the table. Finally one detective slid a photograph across the surface. It showed the abandoned car exactly as it had appeared in 1997, headlights glowing faintly in the dark, driver's door hanging open beside the empty highway. "You remember this night?" the detective asked. The suspect looked at the photograph. His eyes lingered on it longer than investigators expected. Then he leaned back in the chair. "I don't know what you're talking about." The response came calmly. Practiced. Detectives expected it. Denials were common in cases this old. The second detective placed another photo on the table. The burial site in the desert. Excavation equipment visible around the shallow grave. The suspect's eyes flickered again. Still he said nothing. Then the detectives laid out the evidence piece by piece. The fingerprint lifted from the car door. The DNA recovered from the coffee cup lid. The fiber from the vehicle's seat cover. The remains discovered on land he once leased. Each item slid slowly across the table. The room remained quiet except for the low hum of the recorder. For the first time since the questioning began, the suspect's breathing changed. Slightly heavier. His eyes shifted between the photographs and the detectives watching him. The silence stretched longer. Finally one investigator spoke again. "We know you were there." Another long pause. Then the suspect leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His voice came low, barely above a whisper. "You can't prove what happened." The words hung in the air like smoke. Not a confession. But not quite a denial either. And in that moment, detectives understood something clearly. The man sitting across from them had carried the memory of that desert night for 27 years. And whatever happened on that lonely road, he had never expected the truth to return knocking at his door nearly 3 decades later. The interrogation room felt colder as the hours passed. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, casting pale reflections across the metal table where photographs and evidence folders now formed a quiet wall between the detectives and the man who had just been arrested. Outside the room, the sheriff's department buzzed with activity. Detectives moved quickly through hallways carrying reports, lab results, copies of old statements pulled from dusty archives. Phones rang constantly as news of the arrest spread across the region. But inside the interrogation room, time moved slowly. The suspect leaned back in his chair, arms folded loosely across his chest. His expression remained controlled, almost detached, as if the conversation unfolding around him belonged to someone else entirely. One detective broke the silence. "You were on that road." The suspect's eyes drifted toward the photograph of the abandoned car. Then back to the detective. "You've got a fingerprint," he said calmly. "Doesn't mean anything." It was the response investigators expected. After decades, suspects often cling to the smallest technical doubt. A fingerprint could be explained. DNA could be questioned. Memories fade. Witnesses disappear. But the detectives had spent months preparing for this conversation. They knew exactly where to push. Another photograph slid across the table. This one showed the burial site in the desert before excavation began. A barren patch of ground surrounded by low brush and scattered rocks. "You leased that land," the detective said. The suspect shrugged slightly. "A long time ago." "You drove there often?" "Maybe." The detective leaned forward. "That's where we found her." For a moment the suspect didn't move. But his eyes flickered again, just for a fraction of a second. Detectives had seen that look before. The moment when someone realizes the past has finally caught up with them. Still, the man said nothing. So the evidence continued. The fiber from the seat cover. The DNA from the coffee cup. The button recovered from the sand near the grave. Piece by piece, the timeline unfolded across the table. The diner where the woman drank her last coffee. The lonely highway where her car stopped in the early morning darkness. The shallow grave hidden deep in desert land he once controlled. Each fact landed like a quiet weight in the room. The suspect exhaled slowly. "You don't know what happened," he said. "No," the detective replied evenly. "But we know you were there." The suspect's jaw tightened slightly. For nearly 3 decades he had lived with the belief that the truth had disappeared into the desert along with the woman he buried there. The car had been abandoned. The body hidden miles away. No witnesses. No trail. Just empty land stretching beneath a sky that never spoke. But now the evidence had returned one piece at a time. And the story investigators were building left him with fewer and fewer places to hide. The questioning continued for hours. Detectives shifted strategies. Sometimes calm. Sometimes confrontational. Sometimes silent, letting the quiet pressure of the room settle over the suspect's thoughts. They asked him about the night of the disappearance. Where he had been. Why his fingerprint was on the car door. Why his DNA was on the coffee cup. Why the woman's body had been buried on land he leased. Each time the answers came slowly. Vague. Incomplete. I don't remember. I might have stopped to help. Maybe she asked for directions. Every statement floated carefully between admission and denial. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear. The suspect wasn't surprised by the evidence. He reacted as if he had always known the day might come when someone reopened the file. As if he had spent years imagining this exact conversation. Late in the evening, the detectives tried a different approach. They pushed the photographs aside and leaned back in their chairs. One of them spoke quietly. 27 years, he said. The suspect looked up. That's a long time to carry something like this. The room fell silent again. The suspect stared at the tabletop. For the first time since the interrogation began, the hard composure in his expression seemed to crack just slightly. Not fear. Something more complicated. Fatigue. The detective continued. She had a family, he said. They waited all those years not knowing where she was. No response. Now they know. The suspect rubbed his hands slowly together. For several seconds he looked like he might speak. But when he finally raised his head again, the familiar guarded expression had returned. I didn't kill anyone. The words came firmly this time. Flat. Final. The detectives exchanged brief glances. They had heard enough. A confession would have made the case easier. But it was no longer necessary. The evidence told its own story. Investigators ended the interrogation shortly before midnight. The suspect was escorted down a quiet hallway toward a holding cell, the sound of his footsteps echoing against the concrete floor. Behind him, the interrogation room remained scattered with photographs of a crime that had waited nearly 3 decades for someone to finally piece it together. Outside the sheriff's department building, reporters still waited under the dim glow of streetlights. Microphones ready. Cameras pointed toward the entrance. Everyone wanted the same answer. What happened on that desert road in 1997? The official explanation would take months to unfold in courtrooms and legal filings. But the broad outline was already clear. A woman driving home after midnight. A man whose truck crossed her path along a lonely highway. A confrontation in the dark. Violence. Then a desperate attempt to bury the truth beneath miles of silent desert. For 27 years it almost worked. Almost. But the smallest details had survived. A fingerprint on a car door. A microscopic fiber. A trace of DNA on the lid of a coffee cup. Fragments so small they were once overlooked yet strong enough to rebuild an entire crime decades later. And now the man who believed the desert had erased his secret sat alone in a jail cell, waiting for the trial that would force the past into the open. Because some cold cases don't stay buried forever. Sometimes they wait patiently. Just like the evidence that finally unlocked the mystery of that quiet Arizona highway. Morning arrived slowly over the town. A pale Arizona sunrise spilled across rooftops, stretching long shadows down quiet streets where people were only just beginning to understand what had happened overnight. Coffee brewed in kitchens. Radios flickered on. Phones buzzed with messages. And everywhere the same headline appeared. The 1997 desert disappearance, finally solved. For some residents, the news felt unreal. The story had existed for so long as an unanswered question that it had almost become part of the landscape itself. Like the dry hills outside town. Like the endless highways cutting across the desert. Now suddenly the mystery had a face. A suspect. A grave. At the courthouse downtown, reporters crowded the entrance hours before the first hearing was scheduled to begin. Camera crews adjusted tripods along the sidewalk while journalists rehearsed opening lines into handheld microphones. Inside, the building echoed with quiet footsteps as deputies prepared the courtroom. The man arrested the night before would appear before a judge within hours. 27 years after the crime. Inside a holding cell beneath the courthouse, the suspect sat alone on a narrow bench. No television. No windows. Just grey concrete walls and the distant sound of doors opening and closing somewhere down the corridor. For the first time since the arrest, there was nothing left to distract him. No detectives asking questions. No neighbors watching from behind curtains. Just silence. And the weight of a night that had begun nearly 3 decades earlier. Upstairs, the courtroom slowly filled. Family members of the victims sat together in the front row. Many of them had aged considerably since the last time they stood inside a courtroom for this case. Parents now grey-haired. Siblings older, quieter. For years they had attended memorials without answers. For years they had driven past that lonely highway wondering what had truly happened after she left the diner that night. Now the man police believed responsible would walk into the room. Shortly after 9 in the morning, the door at the side of the courtroom opened. Deputies led the suspect inside. A ripple moved through the audience as people turned to look. Some gasped quietly. Others stared in stunned silence. Because the man entering the courtroom did not look like the monster many had imagined for decades. He looked ordinary. Grey hair. Wrinkled shirt. A face that could easily pass unnoticed in any grocery store or gas station across the state. And yet investigators believed that same man had once stood beside a stranded car under the desert stars and taken a life. The judge entered moments later. The room stood briefly before settling again. Charges were read clearly. First-degree murder. Kidnapping. Concealment of a body. Each word echoed through the courtroom with a weight built over 27 silent years. The suspect listened without reacting. When asked to enter a plea, his attorney spoke quietly on his behalf. Not guilty. The words were expected. Cold cases rarely end with immediate admissions in court. Instead, they unfold slowly, evidence presented piece by piece until the past becomes impossible to ignore. After the brief hearing, the suspect was led back through the side door. But the story was far from over. In the weeks that followed, prosecutors began assembling the full timeline they intended to present at trial. It started, as investigators now believed, with a simple encounter along the highway. The woman leaving the diner after midnight. The suspect driving his pickup through the same stretch of road. What caused their paths to cross may never be known completely. Perhaps he offered help. Perhaps he signaled her to pull over. Perhaps she stopped simply because the road was empty and she assumed the man beside her meant no harm. But something changed quickly after she opened the car door. The broken button found near the grave suggested a struggle. The fracture in the neck bones pointed toward strangulation. And the shallow burial miles away revealed the desperate attempt to erase what happened afterward. Prosecutors believed the suspect forced her into his truck and drove deep into the desert where he once spent nights alone exploring remote trails. A place he knew well enough to hide a body without fear of discovery. A place where he believed the desert wind would eventually erase every trace. For years, it almost did. After the disappearance, investigators searched hundreds of miles of desert terrain but never reached the exact patch of land where the shallow grave waited beneath the sand. The suspect returned to his ordinary life. Working construction jobs. Moving houses. Watching the years pass quietly. Occasionally the case resurfaced in the news, anniversaries, appeals for tips, but nothing ever pointed back to him. Until the fingerprint. That single partial print lifted from the car door in 1997. A detail so small it had been overlooked for decades. Once modern databases expanded and technology improved, the match appeared like a ghost rising from the past. And suddenly everything changed. By the time the trial approached, investigators had built a case stronger than anyone imagined possible after nearly 30 years. Forensic science had done what time alone could not. It had reconstructed the moment when two people stood beside a car under a dark desert sky. One of them would drive away that night. The other would vanish beneath the sand. Back in the town where the story began, people still talked quietly about the arrest. Neighbors of the suspect replayed memories in their minds: barbecues, brief conversations across fences, casual waves from the driveway. Nothing about those moments had ever suggested the man they knew might be connected to one of the region's most haunting cold cases. Yet that was exactly what investigators now believed. And as the trial date approached, one truth settled heavily over the community. The desert may hide secrets for years. Sometimes for decades. But every once in a while the smallest forgotten piece of evidence finds its way back into the light. The courtroom was silent when the trial began. Nearly 3 decades had passed since the night the woman vanished along the Arizona highway, yet the tension inside the room felt immediate, raw, as if the crime had happened only days before. Jurors filed into their seats one by one, glancing briefly at the man sitting beside his defense attorney. Some studied his face carefully. Others avoided looking at him altogether. For them, the story they were about to hear stretched back to a time many barely remembered: 1997, a year before smartphones, before modern DNA databases, before surveillance cameras filled nearly every street corner. Back then, the desert roads were darker. And crimes committed in those empty spaces could vanish just as easily as the wind across the sand. The prosecutor stood slowly and approached the jury. He did not begin with complicated forensic explanations or legal language. Instead, he started with a single image. A woman driving home after midnight, he said. The room remained perfectly still. She had finished a late shift. She stopped at a diner for coffee. Then she got into her car and headed down a quiet Arizona highway. The prosecutor paused. That was the last normal moment of her life. Across the courtroom, the suspect sat motionless. The prosecutor continued describing the scene investigators had reconstructed from evidence collected across decades. The abandoned car discovered along the roadside at 2:13 a.m. Headlights still glowing. Driver's door hanging open into the desert night. No driver. No struggle visible inside. Just the eerie stillness of a moment frozen in time. Jurors leaned forward slightly as photographs from the original crime scene appeared on a large screen. Grainy images taken in 1997. Police tape fluttering in the wind. Dust swirling across the road. This case remained unsolved for 27 years, the prosecutor said quietly. But the evidence never disappeared. He began introducing the forensic pieces one by one. First came the fingerprint. An enlarged image appeared on the screen showing the partial print lifted from the car door frame. Investigators had stored it in an evidence envelope since the original investigation. At the time, technology could not match it to anyone. But decades later, when databases expanded and digital comparison tools improved, the print finally found its owner. The man now sitting at the defense table. Next came the DNA. The prosecutor held up a photograph of the coffee cup found in the car's cup holder. The last thing the woman had touched before leaving the diner. For years this meant nothing, he explained. But modern forensic testing recovered genetic material from the lid. A partial profile. And that profile matched DNA recovered from a soda bottle the suspect discarded during surveillance. The courtroom murmured softly. Then came the fiber evidence. A microscopic strand discovered inside the car door. Under magnification, it matched the material used in a specific type of aftermarket seat cover commonly installed in pickup trucks during the mid-1990s. Investigators later found the same style of faded green seat cover stored inside a shed behind the suspect's home. Finally, the prosecutors showed the aerial photographs of the desert land. The parcel the suspect had leased in 1996. The shallow depression that appeared in satellite images shortly after the disappearance. And the excavation site where the victim's remains were eventually discovered nearly 30 years later. The courtroom fell silent again as the final photograph appeared on the screen. A simple silver necklace recovered from the grave. The victim's family sat quietly in the front row. Some held hands. Others stared down at the floor. When the forensic anthropologist took the stand, the atmosphere in the room shifted again. She explained how the bones revealed evidence of fatal neck compression. How the fracture pattern suggested strangulation. How the body had been placed hastily into the ground rather than carefully buried. The details painted a picture of violence that had unfolded under a sky where no one could hear the struggle. The defense attorney rose next. His strategy was predictable. He attacked the timeline. The absence of direct eyewitnesses. The decades that had passed between the crime and the arrest. Yes, my client's fingerprint was found on the car, he admitted. But that does not tell you when it was left there. He argued that the suspect might have encountered the woman earlier that evening. Perhaps he stopped to offer assistance. Perhaps he touched the car while speaking with her. As for the DNA on the coffee cup lid, he suggested contamination. A transfer through casual contact. A possibility, however unlikely. But the prosecution's narrative continued building through witness after witness. Co-workers who remembered the suspect's sudden obsession with cleaning his truck shortly after the disappearance. An acquaintance who recalled his unsettling reaction when the case appeared on television years later. And investigators who explained how the burial site lay deep inside a parcel of land only the suspect had access to at the time. Each piece alone might have raised questions. Together, they formed something far more difficult to ignore. A chain stretching from the roadside encounter to the hidden grave in the desert. On the final day of testimony, the prosecutor returned to the same image that opened the trial. The abandoned car. Headlights glowing in the dark. Driver's door hanging open. That moment, he told the jury, was the beginning of 27 years of silence. He paused. But silence doesn't erase evidence. Across the room, the suspect stared at the tabletop. For the first time during the trial, the confident composure he had shown during interrogation seemed to fade slightly. Because every detail prosecutors presented pulled the past a little closer to the present. Every witness narrowed the distance between a quiet desert road in 1997 and the courtroom where the truth was finally being examined under bright lights. Outside the courthouse, the town waited. People followed the trial on television, in newspapers, on radio broadcasts repeating the same question that had lingered for nearly 3 decades. Would the evidence finally answer what happened on that lonely highway? Inside the courtroom, the answer now rested with 12 jurors. And the weight of a cold case that had haunted an entire community for 27 years. The jury room was quiet when deliberations began. 12 strangers sat around a long wooden table, surrounded by stacks of binders and photographs that told the story of a crime buried beneath nearly 3 decades of silence. Outside the door, the courthouse moved carefully around them, deputies walking softly through hallways, reporters waiting with restless anticipation. Inside that room, time seemed to slow. The jurors spread the evidence across the table again. Photographs of the abandoned car. The fingerprint lifted from the driver's door. The lab reports linking DNA from the coffee cup lid to the man sitting in the courtroom. Satellite images showing the desert parcel where the body had been hidden for 27 years. They talked quietly at first, reviewing timelines, examining testimony, replaying in their minds the picture prosecutors had drawn of that lonely highway in the early morning hours of 1997. A woman driving home after midnight. A man whose truck appeared beside her on a stretch of road where almost no one passed at that hour. A door opening. A brief conversation beneath a sky full of silent stars. And then something violent enough to leave a broken button in the sand and a fracture deep in the bones of her neck. The jurors knew they would never hear the exact words spoken between the two that night. Some parts of the story had disappeared forever. But the evidence filled in the spaces where memory could not. Fingerprint. DNA. Fiber. A shallow grave hidden on land the suspect once controlled. The chain stretched forward from the moment she left the diner all the way to the metal chair where the defendant had sat quietly through weeks of testimony. Hours passed. Outside the jury room, the courtroom slowly filled again as word spread that deliberations might soon end. The victim's family returned to their seats in the front row. They had waited nearly 3 decades for answers. Some of them remembered the first frantic days after she vanished, the helicopters over the desert, the search parties walking mile after mile beneath a blazing sun, the desperate hope that she might still be alive somewhere. Then the years of silence. Birthdays without her. Holidays where her chair remained empty. Every anniversary of the disappearance reopening the same painful question. What happened to her on that road? Now the answer hovered somewhere beyond the courtroom doors. Late in the afternoon, the sound finally came. A knock. The bailiff stepped into the hallway and spoke quietly to the judge. Moments later the courtroom doors opened. Please rise. The jurors filed back into their seats. Some looked straight ahead. Others kept their eyes lowered. The defendant sat beside his attorney, hands folded on the table. His expression remained unreadable, though the stillness in his posture seemed heavier now. The clerk stood with a sheet of paper. The courtroom held its breath. In the matter before the court, the clerk began, voice steady, "We the jury find the defendant." The pause lasted only a second. But in that moment the weight of 27 years seemed to hang in the air. Guilty. The word landed quietly. No dramatic outburst followed. Just a long, slow exhale from somewhere in the gallery. The victim's mother closed her eyes. One of her siblings reached for her hand. Across the room, the defendant remained motionless as the verdict continued. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of kidnapping. Guilty of concealing a body. Each count read aloud like the closing lines of a story that had waited nearly 3 decades to be finished. The judge thanked the jurors for their service. Deputies moved toward the defendant. Handcuffs clicked softly around his wrists. For the first time since the trial began, he turned slightly and looked toward the rows behind him. Toward the people who had spent 27 years wondering where their daughter, sister, and friend had disappeared. No one spoke. The deputies guided him toward the door. When it closed behind him, the courtroom finally released the tension it had carried for weeks. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed as reporters delivered the final update to viewers across the state. The headline was simple. The Arizona cold case from 1997, solved. But for the town where the story began, the meaning went deeper than a single verdict. For years the abandoned car along that desert road had stood as a symbol of something unresolved. A mystery that refused to fade. A reminder that sometimes the truth can vanish as easily as footprints in the sand. Yet the smallest pieces of evidence had endured. A partial fingerprint that technology could not read in 1997. A trace of DNA preserved on the rim of a coffee cup. A microscopic fiber clinging to the inside of a car door. Details so small they were nearly invisible. and yet strong enough to rebuild the past long after the man responsible believed it had been buried forever. In the weeks after the trial ended, the desert road returned to its usual quiet routine. Trucks passed beneath the same open sky. Dust drifted across the asphalt. The wind whispered through dry grass exactly as it had on the night everything changed. But something about the silence felt different now. Because the story that began beside that abandoned car had finally reached its end. 27 years after a woman disappeared into the darkness of an Arizona highway, the truth had found its way back into the light. The town did not celebrate the verdict. There were no crowds in the streets, no cheering outside the courthouse, no sense of victory the way people imagine when a long investigation finally reaches its end. Instead, the feeling that settled over the community was quieter, heavier. Relief, perhaps. But also something deeper. For nearly 3 decades, the disappearance had lived in the background of everyday life. It was the story parents mentioned when warning their children about driving alone at night. The unsolved mystery whispered about at gas stations along the highway where the abandoned car had once been found. And now that the mystery had an answer, people realized something strange. Closure did not erase the past. It only revealed it. In the weeks following the trial, the courthouse returned to its ordinary rhythm. Other cases filled the calendar. Other names replaced the one that had dominated headlines for months. But the story of the Desert Cold case lingered. Journalists revisited the timeline again and again, tracing the path from that final cup of coffee at the diner to the lonely roadside where the headlights had glowed in the dark. They replayed the astonishing chain of events that allowed investigators to reopen a case many believed would remain unsolved forever. The fingerprint. The DNA. The microscopic fiber. Evidence that waited patiently through 27 silent years until technology finally caught up with it. For the victim's family, however, the most important moment came quietly one morning weeks after the trial ended. A small ceremony was held at the cemetery on the edge of town. For years there had been no grave to visit. Only memories. Now, at last, the woman who vanished along the desert highway had a place to rest. A small crowd gathered under a pale Arizona sky. Friends from long ago stood beside relatives who had carried the weight of her disappearance for nearly half their lives. A simple headstone stood at the front of the gathering. Her name engraved into the stone. Below it, the years of her life. A life interrupted on a dark road in 1997. The wind moved gently across the grass as a pastor spoke quietly about remembrance and endurance. There were no dramatic speeches, no attempts to turn tragedy into something meaningful. Only the quiet recognition that after nearly 30 years, the waiting had finally ended. Her mother placed a hand against the stone for a long moment. Then she stepped back. Somewhere beyond the cemetery gates, the same highway stretched across the desert exactly as it always had. Drivers passed along it every night without knowing the story that once unfolded there. The abandoned car. The open door. The invisible moment when one life ended and another began, a secret that would follow him for the rest of his days. Investigators who worked the case returned to their ordinary assignments as well. Some moved on to new investigations. Others continued working cold cases, files filled with photographs and evidence that might one day tell their own forgotten stories. Because the lesson of the Arizona case was impossible to ignore. Time does not destroy every clue. Sometimes it preserves them. Sometimes the smallest fragment, a partial fingerprint, a trace of DNA, a single fiber caught in the seam of a car door, waits patiently until someone finally looks at it again with new eyes. One detective who helped reopen the case said something during a quiet interview weeks later. He was asked what convinced him the mystery might still be solvable after so many years. He paused before answering. "Evidence doesn't forget," he said. That truth echoed through the halls of the sheriff's department long after the cameras left. Somewhere inside the evidence storage room, shelves remained filled with boxes from other investigations. Other names. Other nights where something terrible had happened beneath the same wide desert sky. Some of those cases might never find answers. But others might. Because somewhere inside those boxes could be another forgotten detail waiting quietly for its moment to return. A fingerprint. A fiber. A drop of DNA preserved in silence. Just enough to reopen a story everyone believed had already ended. Back on the highway where the woman's car had been found, the road remained as lonely as ever. The desert wind moved softly across the asphalt. Stars still filled the sky at night, bright and distant above miles of empty land. If someone stopped along that road after midnight, they might hear nothing but the whisper of air moving through dry grass. No trace of the struggle that once unfolded there. No sign of the headlights glowing beside the open door. No reminder of the years when a community waited for answers. But the truth had been there all along. Hidden in the smallest pieces of evidence. Waiting. And in the end, after 27 silent years, those pieces had finally spoken. Long after the headlines faded, the story continued to echo in quieter places. Inside the sheriff's department, the evidence box that once carried the label 1997 missing person now bore a different title. The file had grown thicker: trial transcripts, forensic updates, photographs from the excavation site in the desert. What had once been a mystery had become a complete record. A case that had moved from silence to answers. Yet for the detectives who worked it, the most powerful moment had not come in the courtroom when the verdict was read. It had happened earlier. Much earlier. In the desert. On the morning when the first bone appeared beneath the sand. That moment stayed with them. Because for nearly 3 decades the woman had existed only as a question, her face in missing person posters, her name spoken quietly by investigators who wondered if they would ever find her. Then suddenly the desert gave her back. And the entire case changed. Cold cases have a strange life inside police departments. They sit quietly for years, sometimes decades, long after the original investigators have retired or moved away. The boxes remain stacked in storage rooms, waiting for someone willing to reopen them. Most never leave those shelves again. But every once in a while, something shifts. A new technology. A new database. A new detective curious enough to read through old reports others stopped believing in. In this case, everything began with a fingerprint. A partial latent print lifted from a car door in 1997. Back then, the technology simply didn't exist to identify it. Investigators ran it through the limited databases available at the time and received no match. Eventually the print was sealed inside an envelope and filed away. It could have remained there forever. Instead, 27 years later, someone opened the envelope again. That single moment, the decision to test old evidence with modern tools, set the entire chain of events in motion. The fingerprint led to a name. The name led to surveillance. The surveillance led to discarded DNA. The DNA led detectives back into the desert. Piece by piece, the story rebuilt itself. When investigators spoke privately about the case afterward, many of them returned to the same thought. The suspect had almost succeeded. Almost. If that fingerprint had not been re-examined. If the coffee cup had not been preserved carefully. If the fiber from the seat cover had been ignored. The crime might have remained hidden forever beneath the sand. But small details have a way of surviving when larger things disappear. Wind can erase footprints. Time can fade memories. But physical evidence, once collected, has a strange patience. It waits. Months. Years. Sometimes generations. Until someone looks at it again. Across the town where the story began, everyday life slowly returned to normal. The diner where the woman drank her final cup of coffee still stood along the highway. Trucks pulled into the parking lot late at night, drivers stepping inside for hot meals and quiet conversation. Most of them had no idea the place had once been the final stop in a case that would haunt the region for nearly 3 decades. Down the road where her car had been discovered, traffic passed steadily beneath the desert sky. New drivers replaced old ones. New stories replaced the old mystery that once defined that stretch of highway. But for people who remembered the original disappearance, the road never looked quite the same. They still pictured the scene described in old photographs. A sedan parked half on the shoulder. Headlights cutting through darkness. A driver's door hanging open into the night. The moment when everything changed. For the man now serving a life sentence, time moved differently. Days passed inside the controlled routine of prison walls, meals, counts, silent hours inside a small cell where the outside world existed only through distant news reports and fading memories. Some prisoners speak endlessly about their past. Others never mention it. The man responsible for the desert killing belonged to the second kind. According to correctional officers, he rarely discussed the case. Rarely spoke about the woman whose disappearance had followed him quietly through 27 years of ordinary life. Perhaps he believed the truth had been buried deep enough to disappear forever. Perhaps he convinced himself that time alone would erase it. But the Arizona desert had held onto the evidence. And the evidence eventually spoke. Back at the sheriff's department, the cold case unit continued its work. Other files waited on the shelves. Other names. Other nights where someone vanished without explanation. Detectives sometimes walked past the storage room and glanced at the row where the 1997 case had once sat unopened. Now that box was gone. Solved. But the empty space beside it remained a reminder. Because somewhere in those other boxes, hidden among faded reports and forgotten photographs, another small clue might be waiting. Another fingerprint no one could identify in its own time. Another strand of fiber too insignificant to matter, until years later, when science finally catches up. And somewhere out there, beyond the quiet highways and endless desert roads, another story might still be unfinished. Waiting. Just like this one once did. For someone to open the file again. And listen carefully to what the smallest pieces of evidence are trying to say. Years after the verdict, the case still appeared in training rooms across law enforcement academies. Not because it was the most violent crime investigators had ever seen. Not because it involved complicated conspiracies or dramatic chases. But because it demonstrated something investigators are taught from the first day they enter the profession: never assume a case is truly finished just because time has passed. Inside a quiet conference room at the sheriff's department, new detectives sometimes sat listening to the story from the beginning. The instructor would dim the lights and show the same photograph that started the entire investigation. A car parked on the shoulder of a desert road. Driver's door open. Headlights glowing into empty darkness. The image looked ordinary at first glance. No broken windows. No blood. Nothing that screamed violence. Just a quiet moment captured under a sky full of stars. Then the instructor would ask the room a simple question. What do you see? Some recruits pointed out the obvious details. The open door. The position of the car. The empty highway stretching behind it. But eventually the instructor would highlight the smallest detail of all. The narrow strip of metal along the door frame where investigators lifted a partial fingerprint. A print so incomplete it meant almost nothing in 1997. And yet that fragment of ridged skin would eventually become the thread that unraveled an entire lie 27 years later. Cold cases rarely solve themselves in dramatic bursts. Most are patient puzzles. Pieces scattered across years of reports, evidence envelopes, witness statements written in fading ink. The challenge is knowing which piece still matters. In this case, it turned out to be several pieces working together across time. The fingerprint. The DNA on the coffee cup lid. The fiber from the seat cover. The aerial photograph showing a disturbance in the desert soil. None of those clues alone could have solved the mystery. But together they created a map back to the night when a woman disappeared along an Arizona highway. For the detectives who reopened the file, the case changed how they approached every other cold investigation afterward. They began reviewing older evidence with fresh curiosity. Boxes that had not been touched in decades suddenly looked different. Inside one envelope might be a hair that could now yield DNA. Inside another might be fingerprints that modern databases could finally identify. Technology had moved forward. And with it, the past was slowly catching up. The Arizona case became a reminder repeated often inside those training sessions. Evidence doesn't expire. Even when memories fade. Even when witnesses move away. Even when the people responsible believe they have successfully hidden the truth. Somewhere, a detail remains waiting. Back in the town where the story began, the memory of the case gradually settled into local history. New residents moved into neighborhoods where the suspect once lived without realizing the quiet house down the street had once been surrounded by police vehicles late one night. The diner continued serving late-night coffee to travelers passing through. Truck drivers still parked beneath its glowing sign before continuing along the highway into the darkness. And the desert remained exactly as it had always been. Wide. Silent. Unchanged. If someone drove that road after midnight and pulled onto the shoulder, they would see nothing unusual. No marker. No sign. Just the endless horizon stretching across sand and rock. But for those who remembered the story, the silence carried meaning. Because that empty stretch of highway once held a secret strong enough to survive nearly 3 decades. A secret that only revealed itself when investigators returned to the smallest overlooked clues. The final chapter of the case was written quietly years after the trial, when the victim's family donated part of the investigation archive to a regional history museum. Inside a glass display case now rests a simple collection of items. A photograph of the abandoned car. A copy of the original missing person flyer from 1997. And a small printed image of the partial fingerprint that changed everything. Visitors often pause in front of the display longer than they expect. Not because the items themselves are dramatic, but because the story behind them is unsettling in its simplicity. One night. One roadside encounter. One decision that changed 2 lives forever. And a handful of microscopic details that refused to disappear. Sometimes people leave the exhibit and step outside into the bright Arizona sunlight with a strange thought lingering in their minds. How many other stories are still hidden like that? How many answers remain locked inside old evidence boxes waiting for someone patient enough to look again? Because the lesson of the desert cold case was never just about one crime. It was about time. About persistence. About the quiet power of evidence to outlast even the longest silence. And about a truth investigators know better than anyone else. The past is never as far away as it seems.